When we are talking about strength method, I think the oldest one in the book is probably partial overloads. They've been used since men have been lifting weights, from Paul Anderson in the 1950s, probably even prior to that. In fact, when you look at the old-time strongmen, they did a lot of partial range of motion exercises because they could lift more weights. Partial overloads work mostly by imposing a higher tension on the muscles and nervous system than the body is accustomed to. Obviously, Steph can use a lot more than 25 pounds plates per side, but that just for demonstration purposes. So by using a load that exceeds what you can move over the full range of motion, you're still putting the skeletal structure, the fascia, the tendons, and the muscles under that high amount of tension and load, which will desensitize the Golgi tendon organs, which will strengthen the tendons, which also strengthen the skeletal structure. Basically, it will train your body to be capable of handling super maximum weight. Also, from a psychological perspective, it trains you to hold a heavier weight than you're accustomed to. So for example, if you can do partials with 400 pounds, then when you put 300 in the bar, it suddenly feels light. So from a psychological perspective, it gives you a pretty significant mental boost, okay? Now, obviously, it can also strengthen a specific range of motion. That's the downside of partial movements, just like with overcoming isometrics. They strengthen mostly the angle being trained, okay? Now, some people can have a fuller transfer than others. Maybe 10% of the population can gain full range of movement strength from partial movements. But most people will gain partial range of movement strength, which also makes it a good way to strengthen a weak point, okay? Now, there are several different ways of doing those partial overloads. Here, Steph will do a pin press, which can also be done on rack pulls or pin squats, for example. So just bench press from pins. He has long arms, so we would go with more triceps dominant, so top range of motion. So that would be one option. Another option that is very popular if you follow Westside Barbell, for example, would be board presses or box squats. The difference between, for example, a board press, in which you can use a board here, that you can attach to the bar in different height, okay? That will also reduce the range of motion, but it remains more similar to regular movement in that you do have the eccentric, then the concentric, it's just a shorter range of motion. Whereas when you lift from pins, you're starting from a position where you have zero muscle tension, and you go from zero to maximum tension all of a sudden. That has some pros and cons. The main advantage is that when you lift from pins, you can very easily set up properly in the best biomechanical position to lift the most weight, because you're not under tension at all, so it's very easy to set up and then only press when you're ready to, okay? Which you can't do with a board. The disadvantage is, from a joint perspective, lifting from pins is much harder because you go from zero tension to maximum tension. So even though the muscles will be contracting and producing maximum force, there's a fraction of a second where the joints will take the blunt of the work because the muscles are not producing enough overall tension to stabilize the whole body. So the joints will be more negatively impacted. So lots of strong people moved away from lift from pins for that very reason, because it's really much harder on the joints, okay? So you can go with the pins. Now, some purposes of partial lifting: to fix a weak point, to get used to handling heavy weights, but also there's something called the accentuation principle, used mostly with athletes, meaning that you will train the range of motion that is the most important in your sport. If you are an athlete who needs to sprint and jump, very rarely will you go down lower than a 90-degree knee angle. When you're sprinting, when you're jumping, that's the knee angle you'll be using. Unless you're a catcher in baseball, you'll never go into a full squat position in the sport, okay? So you really need to be really strong in that range of motion. So you can accentuate that by using squats almost exclusively in that range of motion, because you'll be able to use more weight, so you will strengthen that range of motion more than if you train the full range of motion, because you will be limited by the lowest, the weight that you can handle in the lowest position, okay? So that's something I use a lot with athletes in the last phase of training. So we'll use the full ranges of motion early on in the training cycle to build more muscle tissue, because if you move a weight across a longer range of motion, you will build more muscle tissue. It's just more mechanical work, right? More growth stimulation. But at the end of the training cycle, closer to the season, we will move to more partial movements, because we want to emphasize the range of motion needed in your sport. It's also easier to recover from. So that would be the main reason to use partial overload movements.